Well, now we continue our study of the resurrection of Lazarus. We got into this in the first lesson, how much God hates death. But if you have any doubts about that, they'll be gone by the time we get done with this lesson. Unlike any of the previous resurrections in Scripture, this story in John 11 reveals God's personal hatred of death and His answer to its insidious challenge. Now, death targeted Lazarus prematurely because he and his sisters were like a surrogate family to Jesus, and Jesus loved them deeply and they him. Everyone knew about the relationship that Christ had with these two sisters and brother, so that this was a direct attack against Christ. So when it happened, although he wanted to rush to their sides, he wanted to be there, I'm certain of that, he waited patiently because he wanted death to set a trap for itself. And that's a common theme through all of Scripture. Don't you know the devil probably kicked himself for having Daniel thrown in the lion's den? Because it backfired. Not only was Daniel delivered, but every enemy of Daniel in the kingdom was put to death just a few days later. So it all blew up in Satan's face. Same thing happened at the cross. The devil stirred up a mob to yell, "Crucify him," but he did not count on the resurrection of the dead. That's the idea we want to get across here. So let's look at John 11:21 through 24. Now Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give it you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Now Martha's view of the resurrection was very common in that day. Not everybody believed in the resurrection. For instance, the sect of the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection. But most of the Jewish people did. And they believed that there would be a resurrection at the end of time where all the dead were raised at the same time. And we're going to study this to see if that is in fact the case. But this is what Martha believed. The resurrection was a date on a calendar. That's how she saw it. It's a date on a calendar. That's where her faith was. And if that date had not yet come, then there was nothing that could be done for Lazarus, because her faith was in the date on a calendar, something coming in the future. Now here's where Jesus answers her. And he's not rebuking her, but he's setting the record straight. And he says, "I am the resurrection and the life." In other words, the resurrection is a person. And the resurrection is not just a day on a calendar. It's a person. It's a real being. Why is that? Because death is a being. And all through the Bible, we see that death is pictured as some kind of being. Therefore, it shouldn't be strange to us that the resurrection is also a person. Jesus said, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." Do you believe this? Now, this is a veiled reference to what Jesus will do with the church that's coming, because there will be people who will die physically in the church age. But he said even though they die, they still live. Their spirits then are not experiencing death. They have living spirits even after their bodies die. But he also makes a reference to the people who will be alive at the time of his coming. And he said, "Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." In other words, there will be many Christ followers who never actually taste of physical death, because they will be resurrected on their feet. Translated on their feet. Christ is making a reference here to the resurrection of the church. Now, the resurrection is a person because death is a person and must be totally obliterated. So he responded to the situation at Lazarus' tomb as though he were in the presence of a diabolical enemy. And we sometimes read this story and we don't pay attention to this, but let's do. John 11:32. Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Mary is much more demonstrative than Martha. They have unique personalities, and you can see it throughout the story. She fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. Now, this warrants further study. People read past this and they don't pay attention to it. The word troubled here is from the Greek charasso. It means to stir or roil, as in roiling water. In other words, Jesus was boiling right then. And he was not angry at Mary, but he was incensed at somebody. Who? And he said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. When Jesus saw the tomb and saw the setting and is going through it in his mind what these sisters have had to do in burying their baby brother, he wept. But Jesus is not only weeping for them. Here Jesus is weeping for all humanity. He's seeing the big picture. He's seeing every grieving mother who loses a child. He sees every husband who loses a young wife, or every young wife who loses her husband. He sees the death of young people at the beginning of their lives. He sees that. He sees what death has done to humanity, and he weeps because he has compassion over humanity, because death was never a part of God's plan. It came as an outlaw. Then the Jews said this, see how he loved him. And some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind also have kept this man from dying? Again, we see that physical death is the enemy of Christ as well as the enemy of man. Here's what's going on. These people don't know it, but they're speaking under the influence of the evil one. It's no different than what Peter did when he told Jesus, Lord, you don't have to go to the cross. Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. Peter wasn't demon-possessed. He was merely responding to an invisible spirit he didn't even realize was there. And that's what's going on with these people. They are under the influence of this spell of death. And in essence, they're saying, Jesus, we know you could heal the sick. Ooh, but when it comes to death, there's not a thing in the world you can do. That's what they're saying. They may as well have said that. Then Jesus, again, groaning in himself. 2 times this has happened. Groaning in himself, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay on it. This word groaning here, and it appears twice in this narrative, and boy, it is such an important word. It's a Greek word, embremaomai, and it means to snort as a horse does from fear or anger. I was riding horses one time with a friend of mine and with my daughter Sally, and we were riding on a trail out at Dry Gulch, USA, and not far from us was a stallion horse, one of ours, in a corral or a paddock that where the stud horse was with a number of mares. He knew we were coming. All 3 of us were riding on male horses. All of our horses were geldings, none of them stallions. But he sensed the presence of these potential rivals, and that stud horse ran up to the fence, and he began to snort and stomp. He was ready to fight right then and there. He was pacing back and forth. There was anger in him. And you know how horses are so much more aware of someone approaching than we humans are. If you've ever been out riding with a horse and there's maybe a predator that comes, the horse will know it before you do. He will stomp his feet. He senses that. He's got a great sense of smell. He knows what's going on. And so that's what's happening here. Jesus has this sense. He knows there's an enemy present, and he's angry about it, and he's stomping. And so he tells them, roll away the stone. Roll away the stone. He is going to do something. And they again remind him, he's been dead now for 4 days. By this time he stinks. But he now reveals his ultimate purpose in coming to earth. Healing the sick was a part of his purpose. You could never say that was not part of God's purpose. But let me say this, it goes even beyond that. Raising the dead is his ultimate purpose. So let's read John 11:39. Jesus said, take away the stone. Martha, the sister of him who was dead, said to him, Lord, by this time there's a stench, for he's been dead 4 days. Now, I told you earlier that these details always matter. They're never here accidentally. It had been 4,000 years from the time that death had come into the world in the Garden of Eden when Adam sinned to this time. So Jesus is not only going to raise Lazarus, here he is symbolically raising the entire human race. This is a symbol of what is to come. Even though death has had time to decompose Lazarus' body, doesn't matter, God is going to restore physical bodies. We often lose sight of that. We think only of what he does for our spirits and think that we can go on. Listen to me. If the resurrections do not follow where we are now, then the plan of God will be defeated. God's purpose was never just to give us a new spirit only. His purpose was to raise us from the dead. He did that inwardly, but he's going to do it outwardly. It is going to happen. So they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and he said, Father, I thank you that you heard me. Obviously, Jesus had already prayed. He knew this was going to happen. It was a showdown that he'd already seen play out in his heart. And I know that you always hear me, but because of the people who are standing by, I said this, that they may believe that you sent me. Now, when he had said these things, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth! And he who had died came out bound, hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, loose him and let him go. Wow. Christ is the master of death. Now, this is also interesting because this shows a contrast between the resurrection of Jesus and the resurrection of Lazarus. We're not more than a few months away, if weeks only, from the time of Lazarus' resurrection to the time of Jesus' resurrection. The grave clothes were wrapped and bound around the deceased person. So when Lazarus was raised back to normal physical life, he had to be helped out of the grave clothes. But when they came to the tomb after the resurrection of Jesus, the grave clothes were laying there. And here's one of the greatest signs of deity we'll ever see. The grave clothes were folded. Who wins the greatest victory in the history of the world and stops to take the time to fold his grave clothes? That's not the work of an ordinary man. That is the work of deity. God hates death.